lesson, or at least a geography lesson about northern, southern, and central Illinois. And the reality of those areas are quite different from Chicago. And even Chicago is different. It's got the west side and the south side. And if you call somebody from the south side and say they live on the west side, they'll let you know clearly they're not from the south side. And so we have these geographics that go on, geographies that go on around the state. And so I had the privilege of going down to Carbondale yesterday, and I got to see that was a whole different world as well, and was able to sit down and talk with folk and get people kind of excited about organizing there in Carbondale. But since that time, as my eyes have been opened to that reality, the world is still again changing. Less than an hour ago, we had a ruling in St. Louis of the case of the young man who was killed in 2011, and the judge ruled in favor of the police officer that he did not unjustifiably use force. And so this is another long series of events that reminded us that we really do sometimes have to question how much black lives really matter. And so on the train I heard that, so my message at that particular point began to shift. And I was like, well, how do we talk about that? And then we began to just think about all the other things, from the floods that happened. And I'm from Houston, Texas, so I knew the neighborhoods that went under. And Florida, which is still trying to find its way through. And even my son, who is in Atlanta, have the residual effects of the rain. So there's a lot going on in the world, and I know when you gather in your effort here in the university that there are times where it can be easy to get insulated and isolated. And even though you tweet and Twitter, and our president tweets and Twitters, you can still find yourself not quite knowing how to make sense of all the things that are going on. And so today I'm blessed to be here, and I'm thankful to be here. But I'd like to have a conversation and kind of talk with you about some things that I do and some things that I believe would be impactful and helpful for you. But I am a person of faith, and I do work for Faith in Place. And so I'd like you to join with me whichever way you approach your God, or which way you know God, or whatever you approach the Spirit in whatever way, because the Spirit's do operate. I'd ask you to pray with me so we might be as aligned as possible, so that I can give you what I have in my heart, and you can receive it in the Spirit, and then be able to take what you need so that you might go on your journey. So please bow your head with me and gracious God, we come before you, and we know you by many names and have met you in many places. And we thank you for your ever-present Spirit. But right now, Lord, we ask you to bind us, to bring us together as one. We recognize there's so many things going on in the world that make our hearts heavy and consume our spirits. We ask you to help us to be still just for a few minutes, that we might be unified in your Spirit, and that a word might be shared, and a word might be heard, and that we might be made better, not bitter, that we might be changed and transformed and made anew. It's in the precious name of you, who we know by many names and have met in many places. Amen. All right, I got this technology, you know how that works. And then it's too small for my reading now, so that's going to be a problem too. I'd like to speak just for a few minutes on the subject, we are the change we seek, yet we must still have the audacity to hope. We are the change that we seek, yet we must still have the audacity to hope. If you didn't recognize, those are Obamaisms from both his latest writings and some of his earlier writings. And what it reminds me of, and one of the things that the president continued to call us to at that particular time, was to recognize that lots of times we'd like to look for help from the Calvary. A lot of times we'd like hope from somewhere else. And we hope that resources will come to help us, sustain us through the battle. And he reminds us in his first statement, and the thing I'd like you to think on, he says that we are the change. Ain't nobody else to change. There's nobody else coming. We are the change that we seek. We can't look to anybody else to formulate our aspirations or our passions. We can't look for anybody else to fix it up so it makes sense to us and our walk and our talk and our passion and our vision. And we are the change that we seek. But I recognize, too, that after November, whatever day that was, when the election was over and when the tally came in, that there were many of us who lost hope. We were stunned. We were shocked. While we heard the rhetoric and while we heard some of the craziness, we thought that this was just a dream and it'll be over soon. Yet when we woke up that next morning, we found ourselves in a sluggish kind of stupor. We found ourselves shaking our head, wondering what happened and not sure where we went wrong. And out of that stupor, I'm reminded to remind others and to remind you that we must still have the audacity to hope. We must have the audacity to strive. We must have the audacity to resist. We must have the audacity to continue to climb higher. Or as Maya Angelou says, we have to still rise up in the morning. We still have to wash our face and get up and do the things that are necessary. And we must not get lost in sometimes what appears to be the paralysis of analysis of what seems like going on. And we must remember that we must be the change that we seek. And we must have the audacity to hope. The AfricanAmerican national anthem, which we grew up in Houston, Texas, in the little African-American grade school that I grew up in, we had to learn the Negro national anthem. It wasn't the same as the Star-Spangled Banner. It didn't have any lines about slaves in it or any other kind of confusion. It had a line of hope in it, and there's a refrain that goes, "Lest our feet stray from our places where our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land." I'll tell you a story which many of you may not have heard. This is my own personal story, my remembrance of working with President Obama on the Southside of Chicago before he got elected president, and before he was elected to the Senate. He was an organizer on the Southside of Chicago, and that's where I cut my teeth a little bit on organizing, working with him on the Southside. And Barack was from the East, and at least where he was heralding going to Harvard, and we watched him on the South Side as a young man, a little younger than I was, and we watched him doing some of the things that he was doing, and some of the stuff with naivete, some of it with clear eyes of hope and aspirations, and yet also being challenged by some of the challenges that were even existed at that time on the South Side of Chicago. And so he was trying to organize, and so he was trying to take in churches. Anybody knows anything about organizing is that you want to bring in other forces and groups, and you want to put them all in. And he saw himself doing that very well, yet there was one big monster of a church that he wanted to get, and he wanted to organize them, and he was asking for assistance or help or any kind of idea, and he wanted to go into Trinity United Church of Christ. This is the church that he was a part of that eventually became a political kind of bomb, supposedly, in the election. And anyway, he went over to Trinity United Church, and if any of you have been to Chicago and been to Trinity United Church, Reverend Jeremiah Wright was a figure of notoriety. He was a great preacher. He was a great leader. He was a great, awesome person, and spent time with anybody and everybody. But Barack had decided he wanted to go over and organize Trinity. So when he told me he wanted to go, I said, "Well, God be with you." Because we knew what the church was like. We knew it was a wonderful institution, and it was powerful, it was spirit-filled, and if you've ever gone there, the thumping starts when you come in the door, and the thumping don't stop until you leave out the door. And you walk out sometimes higher than a kite because you've been immersed in something spiritual and something fantastic. And so Barack went over there, and he decided he was going to go over there and figure out how he could get Reverend Wright. I'm here to tell you this morning, this evening, that the reality was that instead of him getting Trinity, he got what we call turned out. Now somebody look at me, "Pastor, what are you talking about turned out?" Well, he went in there thinking that he was going to change them, and he came out of there being changed. That he was turned out completely, and that's why out of that experience of the church, he talked about the audacity to hope. Because in the African-American tradition, and many of our traditions, in the spirit of what Trinity does, the reality is that to transform us from those who understand that all things work together for the good of those who are called according to his purpose. And that we understand that no matter what goes on, we must, in all circumstances, because not only of looking back, but looking into the future, we must have the audacity to hope. I don't care if Trump is in the White House, she must have audacity to hope. I don't care if the floodwaters rise above Houston and they carry all along the coast of the southeast coast of these United States. You have to have the audacity to hope. No matter what goes on, whether it's in Sierra Leone or whether it's in other parts of Bangladesh where the waters are rising, we must have the audacity to hope, to believe that compassion will rise to a level where people will no longer look at themselves but find ways to stretch themselves so that we might help and assist others. We must have the audacity to hope. We also must have be the folk that we seek to make change. I'm reminded of how often, sometimes again, we look for others. We look for others to help, and we get disappointed with institutions like the government and others to make change. You know, I stopped looking to Springfield to make change. In fact, when I go to Springfield, I look for confusion, and then I go the other way. When we recognize that many of the challenges that we face, we can't look to these institutions to help us. We must look to these institutions and begin to understand how we can affect and impact them so that we can see change and transformation. I'm reminded of my own history as an organizer. I used to work in Houston, Texas about 40 years ago with a group called the Metropolitan Organization. It was an IAF group, and anybody who knows the history of organizing groups, IAF was one of the Saul Alinsky groups. And Saul had some interest and understanding of things, and he basically believed that you could organize communities, and he worked primarily in the Catholic Church. And the reason he liked the Catholic Church is because the Catholic Church has a particular structure. The priest is in charge, and everybody else is kind of hanging around, and he tells them what to do. And so he liked it because he could give instructions to the priest, and the priest would then mobilize the people. Well, when he ran into the Protestant churches, it's a little more complicated because you've got sessions and you've got councils and you've got other kind of leaders. And so organizing was a little different, but the principle was still the same. Well, I'm an organizer, and I recognize organizing for what it was a long time ago. And I believe that the principle was in the wrong place. It was, in fact, the equation needed to be reversed. It wasn't for organizers to come in and organize communities. It's for communities to use organizing principles to deal with the issues that they need to transform their society. Those are two quite different things. To have somebody to come in and tell you, this is what you need to be organized about, this is what your issues are, is one thing. But when you begin to organize yourself and begin to identify what your issues are and begin to seek change and then use organizers to help you do that, then you take the bull by the horns and you begin to see and make change. And so congregations begin to be able to find their way in making a difference in their community because they have understood what the issues are that are impacting their community, that nobody else has come in to tell them what is the problem and what's wrong. That they've allowed themselves to figure out by having one-on-ones and having conversations with others. And one-on-ones are not nothing new. The organizers come in thinking they're new. We get on the phone and we talk one-on-one with each other all the time and trying to figure out what people are going through and what they're impacted by. So it's not a new concept, but the concept of using organizers to help us organize is critical. And so when we talk about what we are the change we seek, we begin to take responsibility for the issues in our community, and we begin to move so that we can see change come about. I want to tell you there's also some problems or challenges that we must understand before we can move forward in this discussion. I must admit that I was a product of the integration movement. It's never been called the integration movement. They called it the civil rights movement. But during that same period of time, during the civil rights movement, there were many of us who were, I wouldn't say we were test babies, but we were test babies. What meant that what was happening is during the integration period of time, there were many of us young people at that particular time were used to integrate schools and to integrate communities in hopes of this new vision of what this world might look like. The problem is that when you go through a process of trying to realize a new reality, the question is who's defining the new reality? And the word integration, while it was a nice notion, the truth is in really ways many people meant assimilation. And assimilation is quite different from integration. The concept of assimilation means that the goal is that everybody will be in here just alike. Well, the truth is I went through the 60s and came out and there was still no way I could be white. And the presumption that you were going to teach us or educate us to be white folk was really a wrong assumption. Now, to strengthen each and every one of us, black, white, brown, or yellow, to be clear and focused in who we are, and to affirm who we are as people of color, was the ideal and the norm that we needed to push toward. But the reality was that we lost many casualties in the integration effort. We lost good teachers out of black schools, and we lost folk who went into black schools and weren't prepared, white folk in particular, who became casualties to the anger and the frustration that we have because of the tension between the races. And now we have what I call, in that middle passage, we lost a lot of good people. We had pastors, I imagine you remember, pastors who spoke out against racism and injustice, and they were casualties to the war. There were many other pastors who found themselves in the middle of something they didn't quite understand, and were trying to lead people to a new reality. Yet we're finding still that some of the challenges were so far overwhelming. And so acknowledging the middle passage, what I call the middle passages of integration and the casualties from it, we have a new challenge today. What we have is that we thought we had healed many wounds. We thought we had passed by many discussions. But there's evidence even now today that there's still many discussions that we need to have. There's still many kind of discussions or ways in which we need to talk to one another. And that's why I believe continually that organizing is going to be the greatest method for us to deal with environmentalism and how we can integrate, and I don't like to use that word, but how we can make sure that the environmental movement is reflective of the diversity of our society. How we help our environmental movement look at clearly how we can reflect who we are as a diverse people and model what we need to do in the future. I was reminded more recently, I've been at the environmental, what they call climate change table for 2 years. And every time after 2 years, we talk about certain issues, and there's some things that I think, as I know, for some people, a 60-year-old, I sound crazy. Because what I raise is some issues that go back the way into the 40s and the 50s, and I raise issues that I know need to be tweaked in the future. But one of the words, we use buzzwords. You know what buzzwords are, don't you? So like, for example, they use this buzzword in the legislation called low income. I'm talking about what is low income and who you talking about. What's low income? I mean, I got low income when I ain't get paid. Am I low income? What is low income? And I began to help them to understand that if we want to be more diverse, if we want to understand the dynamics of what we're dealing with, we talk about economically disadvantaged and economically challenged. And that has no race, class, color, or creed. That if we talk about the fact that we have neighborhoods, and when I went down to Carbondale yesterday, there are some areas that are economically disadvantaged and challenged. That's what they are. They're not simply black neighbors. They're not simply white neighbors. They're not the working poor. They are folk who come from all kinds of walks of life, but because of the economic kind of mentality that we have of capitalism, that people find themselves economically distressed, economically disadvantaged, and economically find themselves at times just flabbergasted to the extent they can't compete in this age and time. And so if we're going to write legislation, let's not use code language. Let's talk about who we are talking about, what neighborhoods we're talking about, what folk we're talking about, and then how we organize to help them. I don't know if you remember in the church for a period of time, faith communities, there's this kind of notion of benevolence, where many of us would do for others, and we thought it was a part of our benevolent good. We were doing people a favor. But we should never help people because we're doing them a favor. We should help people because it's the right thing to do. We should share our resources not because we're doing them a favor, but we share our resources because these are really resources that come from the higher power. And these resources are not here for us to have, but they're here for us to share. We should look out for other folk not because it's the thing that we do is good, and that would be a great merit on its own, but we do it because it's the right thing to do, and we must do this as people of faith. And so I'm just excited this day to be invited. We're going to be having this discussion for the next 2 or 3 months, talking clearly about environmental justice and the movement and what goes on. We're going to be talking about the ways in which other folk are seeing this challenge and how we can address this challenge. And I hope you come not just taking notes, but I hope you come ready to work, ready to challenge some assumptions, ready to challenge some precepts that we have held that aren't necessarily true. See, one of the things that I recognize as I'm growing older, and I listen to the news and I listen to things, one of the things that I've been kind of disappointed about, but I'm also recognizing that I should have been awake in all of my history classes. You know, history sometimes is one of them classes that it sometimes does make a difference who teaches it. It also makes a difference when the person teaches it, what perspective they come from. And we had some history teachers that would make the history books open up. There were some people who, back in the 70s, would open up chapters and they would talk about certain things perfunctory. If you remember, there was Title IX money back in the 70s, and one of the things that happened is when they would talk often about the civil rights movement in the 70s, and they'd have one page in one history book about the civil rights movement. And it was amazing because you'd say, oh, well, we took it, we did it, we taught it. But they never would catch the breadth of the impact of the civil rights movement, not only then, but even now, so today. Because even now, not only is there a revisionist history, but there's a romanticizing that sometimes goes on the thing. Martin Luther King was not the only civil rights person. In fact, if it hadn't been for Family Lou Hamer, if it hadn't been for other folk at the March on Washington, if it hadn't been for other folk who were working in the streets, Louisa Rizzo, for all the different people who were involved, Jews, Greeks, folks from all walks of life who marched on Selma across that bridge, if they hadn't been for all those folks, then we wouldn't have history as it is. But then now we tend to sometimes focus on Martin Luther King, and he was a great guy and did great things that we still don't know and still are uncovering. But the reality is that revisionist history tends to kind of reduce something to something that makes it minimalized. And so we have a president who says something like Frederick Douglass was a good man. That's called revisionist history, and what it does is it minimizes our understanding of the gifts that we all bring and gifts that others bring. And then we also minimize revisionist history when we don't talk about the statute and the impact of the statutes on people. People put Robert E. Lee statues around the 1900s and in the 1960s to remind people of color who were making change and transition who was in charge and who was on duty. They were not just nice pieces of art. And if you hear anybody tell you differently, then if you'd have gone to history class, you'd have known the reality of Robert E. Lee and what was his impact and what was he all about. And so I'm saying in understanding this that we are to change. We are to change. And we must continue to have the audacity to hope. I was at a meeting in Carbondale last night, and they had a room full of folk. God's meeting is this. We're in a room, we were talking about the Future Energy Jobs Bill, which is a bill that we put together, Faith in Place, a number of other organizations put together and passed. It was a wonderful legislation. But we had recently had some setbacks. Because as you get involved, and when I was working on the legislation, you know, I didn't even know what I was doing. I was working with other folk, and we got it done, and then all of a sudden it was over with, and I thought I was through. And the next thing we know, now we're working on implementation. I couldn't even spell implementation. But now folk are having to work on how do we make this bill happen. And so we're working on that, and so it becomes a challenge. Well, then we learned about a word called EPA. And many of you have heard the word EPA. And then we saw a president come into office, and within a month or two afterwards, he cut money to the EPA. And the EPA is very critical for making decisions about the environment, if you didn't know. And so why would he mess with the EPA? Because there's some things that he's even concerned about the environment, and we need to understand that we're more concerned and must continue to be concerned, so we can't get silent. We can't have siloed conversations. Anyway, what happened was with the EPA, they had a ruling from the ICC, and that's the Illinois Commerce Commission, and it happened last week, and what happened was they voted Ameren, which is one of the utilities here in this area. In the legislation, there are some requirements for them to reach targets for savings for people, for resources and targets for folk that they need to be engaged in. And they want to back up on their commitment to those targets. So they wrote it in the legislation, they agreed to it in the legislation, But now they want to back up and say it's not there. So we've been uproar. Groups like Faith in Place and others have raised an issue with them. So the ICC group last week to them that it's okay not to come through with the targets. And the group was quite different than the ones that were hearing, but this would happen. So one of the members raised their hand in the back and said, well, what are we going to do? They have powerful money and they have resources and they did all that to do that and so forth. And so I just kind of looked at it and said, well, wait a minute, baby. Have you checked out history? Have you checked out the past? Do you know about the march on Washington? Do you know about Selma? Do you know about the history of the farm workers? Do you know about other? I said, we can't give up on one fight. You know, you got to learn how to roll with the punches. And you got to learn how to organize yourself. Because if we're not organized, then we're not going to be successful. But if we do organize, we can make all the difference in the world. And so it is my call to you this day to remember that we are the change we seek. And we must have the audacity, despite what they say in the newspapers, despite what they write revisionist history, we must continue to have the audacity to hold. Thank you. Now, as you probably know, that was condensed. Because when I go into a spot, I kind of look at what I'm looking at, and I realize that there are probably more questions than answers I could give. And there are many things that are kind of wrestling in your mind about certain things, and I try to say some things well, in organizing they call it agitating. And what I call it is you have to learn that agitating is different from irritating. Okay, that was a joke, but it was true. That many times when organizers get to talking at you and so forth, they want to agitate you. They want you to get you all upset. Well, I don't want to agitate you, but I also don't want to irritate you. Because sometimes, you can overwhelm people with information, overwhelm people with what you got in front of it. And I'm saying that we're in a between agitating and irritating. I want to inspire you. I want to get you excited. And I want you to understand that you are the change you seek. But on the other hand, there are times when I do want to kind of irritate you because we can't be complacent. We can't be sitting watching the movie go on and then sit back and then critique it at the end and say, look what he did and look what he said. We can't do that. We can't afford to do that. And so our goal is to make sure that we meet you where you are. And then at Faith in Place, for example, we meet you where you are, and then we try to lead you where you say you want to go, and to help you get there and work with others to get there. It's not enough. The truth is, if one of us alone or one organization alone could do it, it'd have been done. But the truth is, the best work we do is with all of us doing it together and all of us working together, and groups working together that never thought they would work together before. When we were at the climate table, we were with some anti-nuke groups. And I never thought I would be at the table with anti-nuke groups or with the Sierra Club. But when we got to the table and we learned a word that many of us need to learn, compromise, and then we learned how to work together and recognize that sometimes we're going to lose some battles, but when we lose them and do them right, we live to fight another day. And that sometimes we have to be bold enough, and I got a couple of folk, Sister Cindy, Reverend Cindy, and Sister Christina, with here, that they'll talk about you. You ever been talked about? Oh, okay, some of y'all ain't never been talked about. Well, they used to talk about our Savior, but, he got over it too. And so when you make a stand, there are going to be people who are going to look at you and going to talk about you. And you'll be all right. You'll be all right. They used to tell me that, well, these kids don't know. I was going to say one of some of the kids, but yeah, as long as they used to talk about your mama. You ever had your mama talk about? Okay, I know y'all don't know nothing about that. But I used to tell them, I used to tell my brother this and so forth, do they know your mama? And they say, well, no, they don't know my mama. Well, then what difference does it make if they talk about your mama? There are things that we have to understand, that you have to take stuff, because the vision of what we're trying to do is far greater, that we have to sometimes learn how to, as the kids say, do this, get it off. Because what we're doing is far more important than us getting personally sensitive about some of these issues or tactics. All right, so we got open floor. If there's something that you came in here with, oh, we got a good one. Oh, and that's my friend back there. All right. Yeah, well, say your name and then we'll.
Okay, Mary Ann McKee. Can you explain that again, what happened last week with Ameren? I didn't know anything about
Okay, so Ameren was in the legislation. There are some goals and targets that both Ameren and ComEd are required to achieve. Ameren has said about a month or two ago that they couldn't fulfill those targets, and they want to get out of those, of complying with them. And so they made a refiling to do that. We wrote back, and Reverend Cindy had a wonderful blog and rebuttal and went to the hearing. We made it clear why that, first of all, Ameren should adhere to what they promised, and that we needed to make sure that they didn't get an opportunity to renege. And I don't know if Cindy wants to say, Reverend Cindy, you want to say anything about that?
That's what happened.
Okay. And so the group, the commission ruled that they agreed with the groups that were resistant or wanted this to be upheld. But the reality was there's another group which does commissioners that vote together to approve what's transpired. And they voted 4-6 or 4-5 to let Ameren off the hook. And so what we're going to do is continue to put the pressure on, continue to let them know that ain't right, to continue to call that a big corporation should be responsible, and they were part of the legislation as it was written, and they should adhere to what they had promised. And so, but it's target, what is it? I'm going to remember what it is. It's the targets for saving, energy efficiency and savings, I think the savings targets. They promise customers to get a certain amount of savings. And energy efficiency means that they have promised to help raise levels of energy efficiency, particularly with pollution and air and so forth, and they claim they can't do it.
Well, we were part of that whole thing and our household. So does that mean that all of that is wiped out? Or
It's not wiped out. It just means that Ameren is, so the word renege is not the right word. Well, they want to do less for you. And so in the future, and they've convinced the commission to say that that's okay. And our goal is to go back and say, this is legislation, this is law, you were part of it putting together, and we need to make sure that you fulfill your commitment. That's what we need to do. And so that's why I told them last night, it's nice to be mad, but being mad and not doing nothing don't help you. And so the goal is to organize yourself to do phone calls, you can do emails, you can do letter writing, you can make your physical, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable. That's somewhere, I heard it somewhere. And so, but it's about sometimes recognizing that it's not enough to put your mouth on the line, but it is enough to, and so writing blogs, those of you who love to write blogs, all those things, and then educating other folk. Because like just now you asking me that question, there's a lot of people didn't even know what we were talking about. And so that's why I'm real careful about making presentations where it's up here somewhere and you have to bring people down to get it. I try to keep it down here if I can. Okay? That right here, this is my People's Climate March and all my friends. Okay, what we got?
Is this also related to the use of the solar grid?
No.
Just what we do at home, like saving water, saving electricity.
Right. So Ameren is supposed to put in his whole. Utilities have mission and vision, and they do certain things with their policies that can make it easier for you to save. They can make it easier for you to take advantage of, or they can make it complicated. So like right now, you got smart meters, and you got something that I can't remember what the word for Ameren is, but there's another where they want you to get into smart meters and so forth and so on. And those are all different kind of things that you can do that are important. And they can either make it easier to access or they can make it difficult for you to. And our goal is to help them to help us get those targets and not just sell their products, things that they make money off of. Okay. Any other questions? Or I was wild and bedazzled. Yes, sir.
So back in the 70s.
Introduce yourself. So.
Yeah, my name is Mark.
Okay. I met you before.
I live in Urbana.
Okay.
And back in the 70s, we had an oil crisis. OPEC was raising the prices, and so it was, they weren't producing oil. So
Right.
we had long lines, and President Carter introduced something called the CAFE standard. And he set a goal so that those standards would increase. So then President Reagan
Reverend
comes
Shepherd,
along.
go ahead.
Sorry?
Donna, Reverend Shepherd, can you come in? Is she back there? Who's back there? Christina, come. I need you to come. Come. Yeah. Go ahead, I'm listening.
Then President Reagan comes along and he levels them off. President Carter also introduced a national 55-mile-an-hour speed limit on the highways around the country, everywhere, right?
Right.
But all those things are getting rolled back, and as a result, we have much lower average fuel efficiencies than for cars than we could have had those standards continue to evolve, had the speed limits continue to be limited. So I'm kind of frustrated by just the way things just get rolled back.
There's a pendulum movement in public life, and we're swinging perhaps in a way that's not the best for us, but staying engaged during those times. And one of the ways that I think that we can keep being engaged is to see where we are making progress and where there's opportunities for progress. And though the momentum toward more fuel efficient cars is not as fast as it was, the fact is that our cars are much more efficient now, and that we have the opportunity to drive electric cars now. And even a normal car gets way more miles an hour than the car some of us drove back in the day. When my 1974 Ford Torino, Gran Torino Elite, it was an awesome, awesome car, but it got 9 miles an hour. So nobody drives those anymore. We are making progress, and we are have opportunities to continue to make progress. So when we focus on those opportunities and we reach out to others who are wanting to move in that direction, then there is a reason for hope. And we have to cling to that reason for hope and then march in that direction. Yes.
Earl Kellogg, one of the pieces that Reverend Vance talked about was the law that I know Faith in Place was heavily involved in getting passed in the legislature of the state of Illinois. And I know there's been some challenges on implementation, which you
Yes.
also referenced. I don't know a lot of the detail. What's the current status of that? What are the challenges?
The Future Energy Jobs Act was like a landmark piece of legislation. It began to be implemented at the end of June, and we're still in the process where we're figuring out. But what it makes possible for Illinois is incentives to build community solar projects, so that a group or in a city might get together and build not just the kind of rooftop solar that you have that would just supply your house, but the kind of solar array even larger than the one out on Windsor Road for the University of Illinois. And you might have a piece of that, and you might have a piece of that, and I might have a piece of that. And so we'd all be using clean solar energy. So that's one important thing that's happening. What Faith in Place was especially excited about was the provision in the bill that said we're going to set aside some of the energy efficiency money, some of the solar money, and train people so that they can take part in this solar economy that is coming. The green economy for all is really important. And Pastor Vance, who's not here so I can talk about him, was super important in making sure that returning citizens, people who have a record, and also alumni from the foster care system, who are often released from the foster care system when they're 18, and they're just not, who was prepared at 18 to meet the world, but especially difficult. And so those people are going to have special carve out part of their training program so that they can come in, get the job skills for a great green job, one that has a future where they can support their families. And so that's another part of it. the Future Energy Jobs Bill was a huge compromise, and we learned to love the word compromise. But all in all, it gives us opportunities as Illinois folks to enjoy green energy, to promote green energy. It builds small businesses like New Prairie Construction and Straight Up Solar, all those local firms who are making those things happen. And that's really exciting. Illinois is not a leader in very many public policy areas, but in this they are. In energy policy, Illinois is a leader, and we should be very proud of it and take advantage of it.
But we talked about rollbacks from progress, and I understand is one's writing the...
It was the energy efficiency area. There were goals for energy efficiency, and Ameren wrote a plan that they said was the best they could do. And they said that it was the best they could do, but it would be very good for low-income customers. Well, low-income customers live in our communities, and all of us need those green jobs for our communities, and all of us need the lower prices that come with energy efficiency. So we're disappointed, but we're not daunted. We're going to keep pressing, and it'll happen.